20 years later, Millionaire got a call from his ex. Our son is dying. Only your blood can save him. He dropped everything and ran. Hi, my beautiful family. Let me begin with a prayer straight from the heart. Dear God, please heal me fully and bless every soul watching this video. Fill their lives with peace, joy, and endless love. Amen. I'm still under treatment, but your love gives me strength every single day. You are not just viewers. You are my family, my light during dark days, and my reason to keep going. To all our new family members, welcome home. Please introduce yourself in the comments. I truly want to know your name and your story. Now, I want to share something personal. For the first time in years, we faced back-to-back issues. One story had background noise, the next had 2 minutes of silence. And now YouTube is pushing us down. Have you ever had those days when one thing goes wrong, and then another? But my beautiful family, this is not the end. We will rise again. Together, stronger, brighter, closer. If you see my videos on other channels, please know they are fake. They are stealing and re-uploading my work. Please support only this official channel. This is the real Mr. Peter. And before we begin, I have one gentle request. Please like, comment, and don't leave the story halfway. Your one like, your one comment can help save our channel. If you don't like long intros, you can skip, but don't skip the story. Now, James is here with today's story, made with love, faith, and heart. Let's begin together.
The message that would shatter Andy Cole's carefully constructed world arrived at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, disguised as just another notification on his phone. He was standing in his corner office on the 32nd floor of the Cole Digital Arts Building, watching Seattle's Elliott Bay shimmer beneath an October sky that couldn't decide between rain and sunshine. At 45, Andy had learned to find poetry in such moments of indecision, perhaps because his own life had been built on a foundation of choices he'd questioned every single day for the past 23 years. The quarterly board meeting had just concluded with the kind of numbers that would make financial magazines salivate. Cole Digital Arts had revolutionized how artists monetized their work online, creating platforms that preserved the soul of creativity while ensuring creators could actually pay their bills. It was ironic, really. Andy had built an empire helping artists succeed in ways he'd once believed impossible for himself. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, and he glanced at it absently while reviewing the presentation slides. Unknown number. Probably another journalist wanting to interview the mysterious millionaire who never shows his face at gallery openings. Andy had made it a policy never to attend art exhibitions, for reasons that had everything to do with a woman he'd loved and lost, and the paintings he still created in secret that she would never see. He almost didn't open the message, should have just deleted it like all the others. Instead, something, fate, intuition, or perhaps the ghost of every road not taken, made him tap the screen. Andy, it's Jaleesa. Simon is dying. Only your blood can save him. Please. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the glass surface of his desk. The sound echoed through the office like a gunshot, sharp and final. Andy stared at the screen, reading the words again and again, as if repetition might change their meaning or make them less real. Jaleesa. 20 years. 20 years since he'd heard that name spoken aloud, though it had never stopped echoing in the quiet corners of his mind. Jaleesa Jefferson. The brilliant, beautiful woman who had been his entire world when the world was still small enough to hold in 2 young, hopeful hands. Simon. A son. Andy's breath caught in his throat as the implications crashed over him like a cold wave. He had a son. A dying son who needed him, needed his blood, his DNA, the biological inheritance he'd never known he'd passed on. Andy's hands trembled as he picked up the phone again, rereading the message with the desperate attention of a man trying to decode a message from the afterlife. The number had a North Carolina area code. Of course, she'd gone back south. She'd always talked about returning home after medical school, about the communities that needed good doctors, about making a difference where differences mattered most. Medical school. Andy closed his eyes, remembering her bent-over organic chemistry textbooks in the tiny apartment they'd shared near campus. How her dark eyes would light up when she talked about becoming a pediatric surgeon, about healing children, about being the kind of doctor who remembered that behind every case file was someone's whole world. He'd supported those dreams right up until the moment he'd walked away from them. From her. From everything. 23 years old, and so damn sure he was doing the noble thing. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Jaleesa, at 21, standing in their cramped kitchen wearing his oversized University of Washington t-shirt, her hair in the messy bun she always favored when studying, looking up at him with those eyes that saw straight through to his soul. "Andy, what's wrong? You've been quiet all week." He'd practiced the speech, rehearsed the words that would set her free to become everything she was meant to be. But when the moment came, when she looked at him with such trust and love, the words had tasted like ash in his mouth. "I think we need to talk about us, Lisa, about our future." The conversation that followed had been the most difficult of his life. Watching her face change as he'd told her he didn't think they were meant for forever, that they were too young, too different, heading in directions that would only pull them apart. He'd lied through every word, hating himself with each syllable, but believing, God, how he'd believed, that he was giving her the gift of freedom. Her mother had been right, after all. Judge Evangeline Jefferson had made that clear during their one and only private conversation, explaining with legal precision exactly why Andy's love would become Jaleesa's limitation. "She's been accepted to Johns Hopkins," the judge had said, sliding the acceptance letter across her pristine desk. "Full scholarship to one of the finest medical programs in the country. But she's talking about staying here, about turning it down to be with you. Is that really what you want for her? To watch her sacrifice her dreams for a boy who paints pictures and calls it a career?" Andy had looked at that acceptance letter, Jaleesa's golden ticket to everything she'd ever worked for, and knew he had two choices. Be the anchor that kept her tied to a safe harbor, or cut the rope and trust that she was strong enough to sail into deeper waters. He'd chosen to cut the rope. The breakup had been brutal in its kindness. Jaleesa had cried, had begged him to explain what had changed, had promised they could make long-distance work. But Andy had held firm, even when every instinct screamed at him to take it all back, to pull her into his arms and promise they'd figure it out together. "I think you should take the Johns Hopkins offer," he'd said finally, the words scraping his throat raw. "You're going to be an incredible doctor, Lisa. Don't let anything hold you back from that." She'd stared at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Is that what I am to you? Something that's holding you back?" "No," he'd whispered. "You're everything I'll never deserve." 2 weeks later, she was gone. A month after that, Andy had legally changed his name from Andrew Kowalski to Andy Cole, started his first tech company with money borrowed against his father's truck, and began the long process of building a life that looked successful from the outside while feeling hollow at its core. Now, staring at the message that had arrived like a bolt from a past he'd tried to bury, Andy realized the hollowness had never healed. It had just learned to echo more quietly. His assistant, Miranda, knocked softly on the glass door. "Mr. Cole, the car is here for your 4:30 appointment." Andy looked up, and Miranda's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Cancel everything," Andy said, his voice coming out rough and strange. "Everything for the rest of the week, maybe longer. Sir, book me the next flight to North Carolina, Charlotte, Raleigh, wherever gets me closest to—" He looked at the message again, noticing details he'd missed in his shock. to Presbyterian Hospital. Miranda's eyebrows rose, but she'd worked for Andy long enough to recognize when questions would be unwelcome. Right away, sir. Should I arrange for accommodation? Yes. Number, I don't know. Andy ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that carried echoes of the young artist he'd once been. Just the flight for now. I'll figure out the rest when I get there. After Miranda left, Andy walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Far below, Seattle bustled with its usual energy, people hurrying to catch buses, tourists snapping photos of the market, life continuing its relentless forward march. But up here, in this moment, time felt suspended. Simon. He had a son named Simon. The name was perfect somehow. Simon, steadfast, dependable, biblical. The kind of name a woman like Jaleesa would choose, honoring tradition while hoping for strength. Andy's phone buzzed again. Another message from the same number. He's 21. Presbyterian Hospital, Pediatric ICU. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but he's my whole world. Please come. 21. Andy did the math quickly, born 9 months after he'd left. Jaleesa had been pregnant when he'd walked away, had carried their child alone, had raised him without a father because Andy had been too proud and too scared to fight for what mattered most. The weight of 21 years of missed birthdays, school plays, bedtime stories, and father-son talks crashed down on him all at once. He'd spent 2 decades building a fortune and telling himself it was enough, that success could fill the Jaleesa-shaped hole in his heart. But now, faced with the existence of a son who was dying, who needed him in the most literal way possible, Andy realized that all his money and all his achievements were meaningless if he couldn't save the boy who carried half his DNA and all of Jaleesa's love. His phone rang. Miranda, probably, with flight information. But when he looked at the screen, it was the North Carolina number calling. Andy stared at the phone for 3 rings, his heart hammering against his ribs. On the 4th ring, muscle memory took over, and he answered the way he'd answered her calls 1,000 times before. Hey, beautiful. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. Andy? Oh God, Andy, is it really you? Her voice was older, weighted with years and experience, but still unmistakably Jaleesa. Still the voice that had whispered, I love you, against his neck on countless nights when the world was young and full of possibility. I'm coming, Andy said, bypassing 20 years of explanation and going straight to the only thing that mattered. I'm getting on the next plane. Just hold on. Both of you. I'm coming. Andy. I know, he said softly. I know there's so much we need to say, but right now, just tell me about Simon. Tell me what he needs. And as Jaleesa began to speak, her voice breaking with exhaustion and hope, Andy Cole, formerly Andrew Kowalski, the boy who'd once painted dreams on canvas and called it love, began the journey back to the woman he'd never stopped loving, and the son he'd never known he had. Outside his window, Seattle faded into evening, but for the first time in 20 years, Andy wasn't watching the sunset alone. Chapter 2. The Son I Never Knew. The automatic doors of Presbyterian Hospital opened with a whispered promise that some prayers are answered, even when we've forgotten how to pray. Andy stood in the sterile entrance for a moment, adjusting to the fluorescent brightness that made everything look both too sharp and somehow unreal. The smell hit him immediately, that distinctive hospital cocktail of disinfectant, hope, and barely contained desperation that seemed to live in the walls of every medical facility he'd ever entered. His hands, steady enough to sign million-dollar contracts without a tremor, shook as he approached the information desk. I'm looking for the pediatric ICU, he told the elderly volunteer, a woman whose kind eyes had probably witnessed thousands of these moments, families arriving with fear written across their faces, carrying love like a shield against the unthinkable. "6th floor, elevator bank to your right," she said gently. "Are you family?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Am I? After 20 years of absence, did biology alone grant him that title? "Yes," he said finally, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "I'm the father." The elevator ride felt eternal. Andy watched the numbers climb, 3rd floor, 4th, 5th, and with each floor the weight of 2 decades pressed heavier on his chest. What did you say to a woman you'd loved completely and left broken? What did you say to a son who'd grown up without you, who was now fighting for his life with DNA you'd contributed but never claimed? The elevator dinged softly at the 6th floor, and Andy stepped into a hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity. Room numbers blurred past as he followed the signs toward the ICU, his expensive leather shoes silent on the polished linoleum. Somewhere in this maze of medical efficiency was Jaleesa, Dr. Jaleesa Jefferson now, he supposed, and their son. Their son. Even thinking the words felt like stepping off a cliff. He found her standing outside room 612, her back to him, talking quietly with a nurse. 20 years collapsed into nothing. Andy would have recognized her silhouette anywhere, the elegant curve of her neck, the way she held her left shoulder slightly higher when she was worried, the graceful movements of hands that had once traced patterns on his chest in the dark. She'd cut her hair. The long braids she'd worn in college were gone, replaced by a sophisticated style that framed her face and spoke of boardrooms and operating theaters. She wore navy scrubs beneath a white coat, and even from behind, Andy could see the confident posture of a woman who'd become exactly who she'd always meant to be. Dr. Jaleesa Jefferson. She'd done it. She'd become the pediatric surgeon she'd dreamed of being, had probably saved hundreds of children, had built the life of purpose and meaning she'd always envisioned. Without him. The nurse walked away, and Jaleesa turned, perhaps sensing his presence. When their eyes met across the hallway, the world stopped. She was 43 now, and the years had only refined her beauty. Her face was more angular than he remembered, carved by experience and responsibility. But her eyes, those deep brown eyes that had always seen straight through to his soul, were exactly the same. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in the space between memory and reality. Andy. His name was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every conversation they'd never had, every letter never written. Every night she'd probably wondered where he was and why he'd left. Jaleesa. He took a step toward her, then stopped, suddenly uncertain of everything. What were the rules for this? How did you greet the love of your life after 20 years of silence? How did you bridge a gap that wide without falling into it? She made the decision for both of them, closing the distance between them with the purposeful stride of a woman who'd learned to face difficult things head-on. But when she reached him, she stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough that he could see the faint lines around her eyes, the tiny scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off her bike at 7 years old, the small mole just below her left ear that he'd kissed 1,000 times. "You came," she said, and her voice broke slightly on the words. "Of course I came." The response was automatic, instinctive. Of course he'd come. She could have called him from Mars and he would have found a way. They stared at each other for another moment, 20 years of questions hanging in the air between them. Then Jaleesa's professional training kicked in, and she straightened her shoulders, becoming Dr. Jefferson again. "He's sleeping right now," she said, gesturing toward the room behind her. "The medications make him drowsy, which is probably a blessing. He's been so scared, Andy. He tries to hide it because he thinks he needs to be strong for me, but he's 19 years old and he's dying, and he's scared." The clinical words couldn't disguise the mother's anguish underneath them. Andy had seen Jaleesa upset before, stressed about exams, frustrated with professors, worried about her family. But this was different. This was the bone-deep terror of a woman watching her child slip away. "Tell me," Andy said. "Tell me everything." Jaleesa glanced around the hallway, then led him to a small alcove with uncomfortable-looking chairs and a table covered with outdated magazines. They sat across from each other, knees almost touching, close enough that Andy could smell her perfume, something floral and subtle that was nothing like the vanilla body spray she'd worn in college. "Acute aplastic anemia," she began, slipping into the precise language of medicine. "His bone marrow has stopped producing blood cells. We caught it early, which is good, but it's aggressive. He needs a bone marrow transplant, and soon." Andy nodded, though he only half understood the medical terminology. What he understood completely was the fear in her voice, the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "The National Marrow Donor Program has been searching for 6 months," Jaleesa continued. "No matches. His best chance, his only real chance, is a family donor. I tested, obviously, but I'm only a half match. Not enough." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That's when I realized I had to find you." "How did you find me?" Andy asked. "I changed my name, moved around a lot in the early years." "I never stopped looking," Jaleesa said quietly. "I hired investigators twice over the years, but you'd covered your tracks well. Then Simon got sick and I got desperate. I hired someone else, someone better. They found the name change, tracked your business dealings, your address." She paused. "Andy, I know we parted badly. I know you must hate me. Hate you." The words exploded out of him before he could stop them. "Jaleesa, I have never hated you. Not for one single second of one single day." She blinked, clearly taken aback by his vehemence. "But you left. You said—" "I said a lot of things I didn't mean because I thought I was doing the right thing." Andy ran his hands through his hair, that old, nervous gesture that apparently 20 years of success hadn't cured. "Your mother showed me the Johns Hopkins acceptance letter. She made it clear that staying with me would ruin your chances." "My mother?" Jaleesa's voice rose slightly, then dropped as she remembered where they were. "My mother talked to you. She called it protecting your future. I called it loving you enough to let you go." Andy's laugh was bitter. "Turns out we were both idiots." Jaleesa stared at him for a long moment, and Andy could see her processing this information, rearranging 20 years of assumptions. "You left because you thought it would help my career. I left because I was 23 years old and scared to death that I'd ruin the best thing that ever happened to me," Andy said. "Your mother just gave me the excuse I was looking for." Before Jaleesa could respond, a soft voice called from the doorway of room 612. "Mom? Is someone there?" Jaleesa was on her feet instantly, moving toward the voice with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years responding to that particular call. Andy followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The young man in the hospital bed looked like Andy had at 19, if Andy had been mixed race and somehow more beautiful. Simon had Jaleesa's eyes and bone structure, but Andy's hair, those unruly dark waves that no amount of product had ever been able to tame. He was thin, too thin, with the pale, fragile look of someone whose body was betraying them. But when he smiled at his mother, Andy saw strength there, and humor, and something indefinably familiar. "Hey, baby," Jaleesa said, moving to his bedside and smoothing his hair with the automatic gesture of mothers everywhere. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but I'm okay." Simon's gaze moved past his mother to Andy, and curiosity flickered in his expression. "Who's this?" Jaleesa looked back at Andy, a question in her eyes. Andy stepped forward, suddenly understanding that this moment would define everything that came after. "I'm Andy," he said simply. "I'm your father." Simon studied him for a long moment, those familiar brown eyes, Jaleesa's eyes, taking in every detail. Andy had expected anger, accusation, demands for explanations. Instead, Simon smiled, a small, tired smile, but genuine. "So you're the artist," Simon said. "Mom always said I got my artistic streak from my father." Andy's throat closed completely. He looked at Jaleesa, who was watching this first meeting between father and son, with tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "She told you about me," Andy managed. "She told me you were talented and kind and that you loved her very much," Simon said. "She said you had to go away before I was born, but that someday, if it was meant to happen, we'd meet." Andy sank into the chair beside the bed, overwhelmed by this young man's grace, by Jaleesa's kindness in how she'd framed his absence. "Simon, Are you here to help?" Simon interrupted gently. "Because honestly, I could really use some good news right about now." Andy looked at this remarkable boy, his son, and felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked away for 20 years. "Yes," he said, his voice steady for the first time since he'd read that message. "I'm here to help. I'm here for as long as you need me." Simon's smile widened, and for the first time in 2 decades, Andy Cole felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Chapter 3. Ghosts in the Waiting Room. The waiting room at 3 in the morning held a different kind of silence, deeper, more honest, stripped of the daytime pretenses that helped people avoid looking too closely at their fears. Andy sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching Jaleesa sleep fitfully in the chair across from him. She'd finally succumbed to exhaustion around midnight, her head tilted at an angle that would leave her neck aching when she woke. Even in sleep, worry lines creased her forehead, and her hands remained clenched in her lap as if she were still fighting battles in her dreams. The blood work had taken longer than expected. Andy's rare AB-negative blood type was indeed a perfect match for Simon, but the compatibility testing required for bone marrow transplantation was more complex. Dr. Nathaniel Reeves, the lead hematologist, had explained the process with clinical precision, while Jaleesa translated the medical jargon into terms Andy could understand. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 20 years apart, she was still helping him navigate unfamiliar territory. Now they waited. And in the silence between one breath and the next, 20 years of unspoken words pressed against Andy's chest like a physical weight. Jaleesa stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she looked confused, disoriented by sleep and fluorescent lighting. Then her gaze found Andy's, and reality crashed back over her features. "What time is it?" she asked, straightening in her chair and immediately reaching for her phone to check on Simon. "Just after 3. Simon's still sleeping. I checked 10 minutes ago." She nodded, running her hands over her face in a gesture that was achingly familiar. Jaleesa had always been beautiful in the morning, or in this case, the deep middle of night, with her defenses down and her professional mask temporarily set aside. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. "I know this must be overwhelming for you." Andy almost laughed at the understatement. Overwhelming. Yes, learning you had a dying son while simultaneously coming face to face with the woman you'd never stopped loving could reasonably be called overwhelming. "Where else would I be?" he asked instead. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Jaleesa studied his face in the harsh waiting room lighting, and Andy wondered what she saw there. Did she see the boy who'd once painted pictures of her sleeping, or just a stranger in an expensive suit who happened to share her son's DNA? "I need you to understand something," Jaleesa said suddenly, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of carefully guarded thoughts. "I didn't track you down to disrupt your life. I didn't come looking for you because I wanted to reopen old wounds, or because I had some fantasy about picking up where we left off." Andy felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I know that. Do you?" She leaned forward slightly, and Andy caught a glimpse of the fierce protectiveness that had probably made her an exceptional doctor. Because Simon is my entire world, Andy. Everything I've done for the past 19 years has been about giving him the best life possible. I won't let anything or anyone hurt him, even if it means protecting him from his own father. The words stung, but Andy understood them. He'd walked away once. From her perspective, what guarantee did she have that he wouldn't do it again? Tell me about him, Andy said instead of defending himself. Tell me about Simon. What was he like as a little boy? What does he love? What makes him laugh? Jaleesa's defensive posture softened slightly. He was the most curious child, always asking why. Why is the sky blue? Why do flowers need water? Why do some people have more money than others? I used to joke that he'd either become a philosopher or a lawyer. What did he choose? Environmental law, actually. He wants to use art and advocacy to fight climate change. He says legal briefs are just another form of storytelling, and stories change the world. Jaleesa's smile was soft, maternal, full of pride. He got that from you, I think. The belief that creativity can heal things. Andy's throat tightened. What else? He painted his first mural when he was 12, the side of Mrs. Delacroix's garage. She's our neighbor. Simon asked permission first, of course, but I still nearly had a heart attack when I came home from the hospital and saw him up on a ladder with a brush in his hand. Jaleesa's laugh was quiet but genuine. It was beautiful, though. A garden scene with butterflies and hummingbirds. Mrs. Delacroix still won't let anyone paint over it. Does he know? About the art, I mean. That I'm an artist, too. Jaleesa hesitated. I told him his father was creative and talented. I didn't know about your success, Andy. The last I knew, you were a struggling college student who painted in his spare time. Andy nodded. It made sense. He'd built his empire quietly, deliberately staying out of the public eye, using his business acumen while keeping his artistic soul carefully hidden. Even his company's marketing materials featured other artists' work, never his own. What about you? He asked. Tell me about Dr. Jaleesa Jefferson. Did you get everything you wanted? Most of it. Jaleesa's expression grew more guarded. I finished at Johns Hopkins, did my residency at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and came back home to North Carolina 8 years ago. I run the pediatric surgery department at Presbyterian now. That's incredible, Lisa. You did exactly what you always said you'd do. Don't. The word came out sharper than she'd probably intended. Don't call me Lisa. Not anymore. Andy flinched. She'd always been Lisa to him. Never Jaleesa. Lisa when she was sleepy and warm in his arms. Lisa when she laughed at his terrible jokes. Lisa when she cried during sad movies. But that intimacy was apparently off limits now, another casualty of his long-ago decision to walk away. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Jaleesa. She sighed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you. It's been a very long few months, and hearing that name again brings back things I'd rather leave buried. What things? Jaleesa was quiet for so long that Andy thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Do you want to know what the worst part was, after you left? Andy wasn't sure he did, but he nodded anyway. The worst part wasn't the heartbreak, though that nearly killed me. The worst part wasn't being pregnant and alone, though that was terrifying. The worst part was that I kept expecting you to come back. Jaleesa's laugh was bitter, hollow. For months, I kept thinking you'd realize you'd made a mistake. I kept thinking you'd show up at my door and explain that it had all been some terrible misunderstanding. Andy's hands clenched in his lap. Jaleesa. I used to practice what I'd say to you, she continued as if he hadn't spoken. I'd rehearse these conversations where you'd apologize and I'd forgive you and we'd figure out how to be a family. Even after Simon was born, even after I realized you weren't coming back, part of me kept hoping. Why didn't you try to find me sooner? Andy asked. If you wanted me to come back, why didn't you tell me about Simon? Jaleesa's eyes flashed. Because wanting you to come back and actually asking you to come back are two very different things, Andy. Because I had my pride and Simon had his needs, and I wasn't going to go begging to a man who'd made it clear he didn't want us. I never said I didn't want you. You didn't have to say it. You left. You disappeared. You changed your name for God's sake. Jaleesa's voice rose slightly, then dropped as she remembered where they were. What was I supposed to think? Andy stared at his hands, at the expensive watch that had replaced the cheap digital one he'd worn in college, at the wedding ring finger that had remained bare for 20 years. How could he explain that leaving her had been the hardest thing he'd ever done? That every day since had been an exercise in surviving without the other half of his soul? I thought I was setting you free, he said finally. Your mother showed me the Johns Hopkins letter, told me how much potential you had, how far you could go if you weren't tied down by a guy like me. I was 23 years old, Jaleesa. I had no money, no prospects, no clear vision of my future. You had this incredible opportunity, and I thought if I loved you enough to let you go, you'd have the chance to become everything you were meant to be. And did you ever consider that maybe what I was meant to be was someone who chose her own path? Jaleesa's voice was steady, but Andy could see the pain underneath. Did you ever think that maybe I was smart enough to make my own decisions about my future? Every day, Andy admitted. Every single day for 20 years. They sat in silence after that, the weight of missed opportunities and misguided noble intentions settling between them like dust. Somewhere in the distance, Andy could hear the soft sounds of a hospital at night, monitors beeping, nurses' soft footsteps, the whispered conversations of other families keeping their own vigils. He tested gifted, Jaleesa said suddenly. Simon, in elementary school. Art and writing mostly, but exceptional spatial reasoning too. His teachers said he saw patterns other kids missed. Andy looked up, surprised by the subject change. I used to wonder if you'd be proud of him, Jaleesa continued. If you could see him paint or watch him solve a complicated problem, if you'd recognize something of yourself in him. I'm already proud of him, Andy said. Just from the hour I spent with him tonight, I can see he's remarkable. And that's because of you, Jaleesa, because of the mother you've been to him. He asks about you sometimes, she said quietly. Not often, and never when he thinks I'm upset. But sometimes he'll see a painting in a museum or watch a movie about artists, and he'll get this look on his face, like he's trying to imagine what his father might be like. Andy's chest tightened. What do you tell him? The truth, that I loved you very much, and that I believe you would have loved him if circumstances had been different. Circumstances. Andy's laugh was hollow. Is that what we're calling my cowardice now? You weren't a coward, Andy. You were young and scared and trying to do what you thought was right. And what about you? Were you scared? Jaleesa was quiet for a moment. Terrified, she said finally. But I was also stubborn enough to believe that love could overcome anything. I was wrong about that. Were you? Andy asked. Because looking at Simon, at the incredible young man you've raised, at the career you've built, at the lives you've saved, maybe love did overcome everything. Maybe it just took a different form than we expected. Jaleesa studied his face in the fluorescent lighting, and for a moment Andy saw a flicker of the girl he'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings. The test results should be back in a few hours, she said, changing the subject again. And if I'm a match, then we proceed with the transplant as soon as possible. Simon's condition is stable for now, but we can't wait much longer. Andy nodded. And after? After the transplant? Jaleesa looked at him for a long moment. I suppose that depends on a lot of things we haven't figured out yet. Such as? Such as whether you're planning to disappear again once this is over. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with 20 years of hurt and hope. Andy wanted to tell her that he'd never leave again, that he'd spend the rest of his life making up for lost time, that he'd be whatever Simon needed him to be. But words were just words, and he'd already broken too many promises to this woman. I'm not going anywhere, he said instead. Not unless you ask me to. Jaleesa nodded slowly, but Andy could see the skepticism in her eyes. Trust, once broken, didn't heal overnight. From down the hall came the soft sound of a door opening, and Dr. Reeves appeared looking tired but alert. Andy and Jaleesa both stood, the movement automatic and synchronized. Good news, Dr. Reeves said, and Andy felt his knees go weak with relief. You're a perfect match, Mr. Cole. We can proceed with the transplant. As Jaleesa broke into tears of relief and gratitude, Andy felt something shift inside his chest, a door opening after 20 years of being locked shut. He was going to save his son. And maybe, if he was very careful and very lucky, he might find a way to save himself in the process. Chapter 4. The Surgery and the Vigil. Dawn painted the hospital windows in shades of amber and rose, but Andy barely noticed the beauty of sunrise as he lay on the pre-surgical gurney, watching nurses prepare for the bone marrow extraction that would save his son's life. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 20 years of living half a life, he was finally able to give something that mattered. Not money, not success, not the empire he'd built to fill the Jaleesa-shaped hole in his heart, but the simple, biological gift that only he could provide. Any last-minute questions, Mr. Cole? Dr. Reeves asked, reviewing Andy's chart one final time. The procedure was routine for the medical team, but Andy knew that for Simon, it represented hope itself. How long will it take? Andy asked, though the timeline had been explained multiple times. He was stalling, he realized, trying to memorize this moment, the moment before he became the father he should have been 19 years ago. About 4 hours for the extraction, then immediate processing and transfer to Simon. He'll receive your cells this afternoon if everything goes smoothly. Andy nodded, then looked across the pre-surgical area to where Jaleesa stood in her scrubs. She'd insisted on assisting with Simon's portion of the procedure, and Andy had seen the internal battle in her eyes, the doctor who needed professional control, warring with the mother who was terrified of losing her child. Jaleesa, he called softly, and she looked up from the medical charts she'd been studying. Take care of him. I will, she promised, and in those 2 words Andy heard 20 years of fierce maternal protection. This woman had raised their son alone, had guided him through childhood illnesses and teenage heartbreaks, had been both mother and father when Andy was too proud and too scared to claim his place. If anyone could shepherd Simon through this dangerous passage, it was her. The anesthesia mask settled over Andy's face, and his last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever powers governed second chances and the hearts of foolish men. When Andy woke hours later, the world felt fuzzy around the edges, but the first face he saw was clear as daylight. Serafina Williams, Jaleesa's best friend, sat beside his recovery bed with the kind of warm smile that suggested she'd been watching over sleeping people for most of her nursing career. Welcome back to the land of the living, Serafina said, checking his IV with practiced efficiency. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, Andy admitted, testing his voice. His lower back ached where they'd extracted the bone marrow, but underneath the physical discomfort was something else, a lightness he hadn't felt in decades. That's perfectly normal. The good news is that everything went beautifully. Your bone marrow is already being processed for Simon. And Simon? How is he? Serafina's smile widened. Prepped and ready. Jaleesa's with him now, getting him settled for the transfusion. That woman hasn't left his side except to check on you, and let me tell you, she's been checking on you a lot. Andy felt something warm unfurl in his chest. She has. Every 20 minutes like clockwork. I finally had to assign someone else to monitor your vitals because she was driving the entire surgical team crazy with her hovering. Serafina laughed, a rich sound that filled the recovery room. That woman has been in love with you for 20 years, you know. Even when she was furious with you, even when she was trying to convince herself she'd moved on, it was always you. She told you about us? Honey, I lived through the breakup. I held her hair while she threw up from morning sickness and cried about how she was going to raise a baby alone. I watched her work herself to death in medical school because studying was easier than thinking about what she'd lost. Serafina's expression grew more serious. I also watched her turn down perfectly good men because none of them measured up to a memory. Andy absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the successful, independent woman he'd found with the heartbroken girl Serafina described. She seemed so together, so complete. Jaleesa Jefferson is one of the strongest women I know, but strength and completeness aren't the same thing. She built a beautiful life, yes, but there was always a piece missing. A piece shaped exactly like you. Before Andy could respond, another voice joined the conversation. I hope you're not filling this man's head with romantic nonsense, Serafina. Andy looked up to see an elegant woman in her 70s approaching his bedside. She had Jaleesa's bone structure and the kind of regal bearing that came from years of commanding courtrooms. Judge Evangeline Jefferson, without question, though she looked smaller somehow than she had in Andy's memory. Mrs. Jefferson, Andy said, struggling to sit up straighter. Even 20 years later, this woman intimidated him. It's Judge Jefferson, actually, she corrected, but not unkindly. Though I suppose, under the circumstances, you can call me Evangeline. Serafina excused herself with a meaningful look, leaving Andy alone with the woman who had orchestrated his exit from Jaleesa's life 2 decades ago. I owe you an apology, Evangeline said without preamble, settling into the chair Serafina had vacated. Several apologies, actually, but let's start with the most obvious one. I was wrong to interfere in your relationship with my daughter. Andy stared at her, speechless. This was not the conversation he'd expected to have while recovering from surgery. I was a federal judge in 1995, Evangeline continued. I'd seen too many promising young women, particularly young black women, sacrifice their potential for love. I'd watched brilliant minds relegated to supporting roles because they chose marriage over career. When Jaleesa showed me that Johns Hopkins acceptance letter and then told me she was considering turning it down to stay close to you, I panicked. So you decided to get rid of me. I decided to test you, Evangeline corrected. I wanted to see if you loved my daughter enough to fight for her, or if you'd crumble under pressure. I expected you to argue with me, to tell me I was wrong, to prove that your love was stronger than my doubts. Andy felt a cold understanding wash over him. Instead, I ran. You ran, Evangeline confirmed. And in doing so, you proved my point about young love being fragile and unreliable. Except ... Except? Except I was wrong about everything else. Wrong about what Jaleesa needed. Wrong about what would make her happy. Wrong about the kind of man you were. Evangeline's voice grew softer. I spent 20 years watching my daughter build a magnificent life while something essential inside her remained broken. I watched her raise a grandson I adore while always knowing there was a father-shaped hole in his world that I had helped create. Andy didn't know what to say. Apologies felt insufficient. Anger felt pointless after so much time had passed. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. Because my grandson is lying in an operating room, fighting for his life with the help of bone marrow from a father he's never known, Evangeline said. Because I've had 20 years to regret my choices, and because I'm hoping it's not too late for all of us to do better. Before Andy could respond, Dr. Reeves appeared in the doorway. Mr. Cole, Simon's transfusion is complete. Everything went perfectly. Would you like to see him? Andy was out of bed before his brain fully processed the words, ignoring the ache in his back and the protests from his IV line. Evangeline steadied him with a surprisingly strong grip. "Easy there," she said. "He's not going anywhere." But Andy needed to see for himself, needed to lay eyes on the son who was now carrying his bone marrow, his DNA, his cellular gift of life. The wheelchair ride to Simon's room felt eternal, but when they arrived, Andy forgot about his own discomfort entirely. Simon was awake, pale but alert, with color in his cheeks that hadn't been there before. He looked up when Andy entered, and his smile was brighter than any sunrise Andy had ever painted. "Hey, Dad," Simon said, and the word hit Andy like a physical blow. "Thank you." Jaleesa stood beside Simon's bed, tears streaming down her face, still wearing her surgical scrubs. When she looked at Andy, her expression was soft and grateful and complicated in ways that made his chest tight. "The transfusion went perfectly," she said. "Simon's body is already responding well to your cells. We'll need to monitor him closely for the next few weeks. But Dr. Reeves is cautiously optimistic." Andy wheeled closer to the bed, reaching out tentatively to touch Simon's hand. His son's fingers were warm and strong, and when Simon squeezed back, Andy felt something fundamental shift inside his heart. "How do you feel?" Andy asked. "Different," Simon said thoughtfully. "Stronger, maybe. It's probably psychological, but I swear I can feel your cells in there fighting for me." "They are fighting for you," Andy said. "We both are." Over the next several hours, Andy's room became an unlikely gathering place. Serafina brought coffee and homemade cookies, explaining that feeding people was how she dealt with stress. Cordelia Nash, Simon's art teacher, arrived with a sketchbook filled with drawings from Simon's classmates, get-well messages rendered in pencil and paint by teenagers who clearly adored their teacher and their classmate. "Simon is special," Cordelia told Andy, settling into one of the uncomfortable hospital chairs. "I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've never had a student with his combination of technical skill and emotional intelligence. His paintings tell stories that most adults can't articulate." Andy studied the woman who had been a mentor to his son. Cordelia was probably in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair and paint-stained fingers that spoke of a lifetime devoted to art. "Thank you for being there for him." "Thank you for giving him life," Cordelia replied simply. "Twice now." Ezekiel Thompson, the hospital chaplain, stopped by as evening approached. He was a tall man with gentle eyes and the kind of presence that seemed to calm whatever room he entered. "I've been praying for your family," Ezekiel told Andy. "All of your family, including the relationships that are healing along with Simon's body." Andy found himself oddly comforted by this stranger's faith, even though his own relationship with religion had always been complicated. "Thank you." "Healing comes in many forms," Ezekiel said quietly. "Sometimes the body heals first, sometimes the heart. But in my experience, they're usually connected." As the day wore on, Andy began to understand the community that Jaleesa and Simon had built. These weren't just friends or colleagues. They were chosen family, people who had stepped into the gaps left by Andy's absence and helped raise a remarkable young man. The realization was humbling. Jaleesa hadn't just survived his departure, she'd thrived, creating a support system that was probably stronger than anything he could have provided at 23. But now, watching her interact with the people who loved her and Simon, Andy began to wonder if there might be room in this carefully constructed world for one more person, one more chance. As visiting hours ended and the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, Andy found himself alone with Jaleesa in Simon's room. Their son was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady and strong. "Thank you," Jaleesa said quietly. "For today, for the bone marrow, for staying. I know this isn't how you plan to spend your week." "This is exactly how I want to spend my week," Andy replied. "This is exactly where I want to be." Jaleesa looked at him for a long moment, and Andy saw something shift in her expression, a softening around the edges, a tentative hope. "Simon's going to need time to recover," she said. "Weeks, possibly months of careful monitoring." "I'm not going anywhere," Andy said, and this time when he made the promise, he could see that she was beginning to believe him. Chapter 5. When Simon Wakes. The morning light that filtered through Simon's hospital room window carried promises that neither Andy nor Jaleesa dared voice aloud, promises of recovery, of second chances, of a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Simon had been sleeping for 18 hours straight, his body working to integrate the new bone marrow cells that would either save his life or— Andy refused to complete that thought. Instead, he focused on the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, the healthy color returning to cheeks that had been too pale for too long. Andy had barely left the room since the transfusion. He dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable reclining chair, waking every time a monitor beeped or a nurse came to check vitals. Jaleesa had tried to convince him to get proper rest in his own room, but he couldn't bear the thought of being away when Simon woke up. What if his son needed him? What if this was the only chance Andy would ever have to be the father he should have been all along? "You know, watching someone sleep isn't going to make them heal faster," Jaleesa said softly from her spot by the window. She'd been there since dawn, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, still wearing the same scrubs from yesterday's surgery. "I know," Andy replied, but he didn't move his gaze from Simon's face. I don't want to miss anything. I've already missed 19 years. Jaleesa was quiet for a moment, and when Andy finally looked at her, he saw understanding in her expression rather than judgment. "He's not going anywhere, Andy. The transplant was successful. Dr. Reeves said his preliminary blood work shows excellent integration." "But you're still worried," Andy observed. "I can see it in the way you're holding your shoulders." Jaleesa's laugh was soft but surprised. "You always could read me too well. Some things don't change, and some things do." Jaleesa set down her coffee cup and moved closer to Simon's bed. 20 years ago, when you knew me, my biggest worry was whether I'd pass organic chemistry. Now I'm watching my son fight for his life with bone marrow from a man I thought I'd never see again. Everything has changed, Andy." Before Andy could respond, Simon stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, and when his gaze focused on the two adults watching him with barely contained anxiety, he smiled. "Hey," Simon said, his voice hoarse but strong. "Please tell me you two haven't been staring at me all night like I'm some kind of science experiment." "Only for the last 6 hours," Andy said, relief flooding through him so powerfully that he felt lightheaded. "How do you feel?" Simon considered this seriously, the way he seemed to approach most questions. "Better. Definitely better. Like something that was broken is starting to fix itself." He looked between his parents, and Andy was struck again by his son's remarkable maturity. "So, what happens now?" "Now we monitor your progress for the next few weeks," Jaleesa said, slipping seamlessly into doctor mode. "Your body needs time to fully accept the new cells and start producing healthy blood on its own. But so far, everything looks very promising." "And you're staying?" Simon asked, looking directly at Andy. The question was simple, but Andy heard layers of meaning underneath it. Was he staying for the recovery? Was he staying in North Carolina? Was he staying in their lives? "I'm staying as long as you want me here." Andy said carefully. Good, Simon said with the decisiveness of someone who'd learned not to waste time on uncertainty. Because I have about 19 years' worth of questions for you. Andy laughed despite the emotion tightening his throat. I have 19 years' worth of answers, and probably that many questions for you too. Can I ask you something? Simon said, struggling to sit up straighter. Jaleesa immediately moved to help him, adjusting his pillows with the automatic care of someone who'd been managing his comfort for months. Anything, Andy said. Are you really an artist? I mean, I know Mom said you were, but people say a lot of things. Are you actually good at it? Andy glanced at Jaleesa, who nodded encouragingly. I am. I was, anyway. I started as a painter, actually. Portraits, mostly, though I dabbled in landscapes. Started as? What do you do now? I run a tech company that creates platforms for digital artists. Cole Digital Arts. We help artists sell their work online, manage commissions, build sustainable careers. Andy paused. I haven't painted in years, though. Not since you left, Simon finished quietly. Number not, since then. Simon absorbed this information with the thoughtful expression Andy was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Why did you stop? The question caught Andy off guard. He'd expected queries about the business, about money, about the practical aspects of his life. He hadn't expected his son to cut straight to the heart of things. I guess painting reminded me too much of everything I'd left behind. It was easier to focus on the business side of art rather than the creative side. That's sad, Simon said with the brutal honesty of youth. I mean, it's cool that you built a successful company and all, but giving up something you love because it hurts too much seems like letting the pain win. Andy stared at his son, struck by the simple wisdom in those words. When had he become someone who let pain win? When had he decided that avoiding reminders of Jaleesa was more important than pursuing the passion that had defined him? You're right, Andy said slowly. It is sad, and it was definitely letting the pain win. Well, you're here now, Simon said pragmatically. Maybe it's time to stop letting it win. Jaleesa had been listening to this exchange with an expression Andy couldn't quite read. Now she moved to the small closet in the corner of the room and pulled out a worn leather portfolio. Simon, she said, maybe you should show your father some of your work. Simon's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that transformed his entire face. Would you want to see it? I mean, I know I'm probably not very good compared to professional artists, but I would love to see your work, Andy said, and meant it completely. Jaleesa handed the portfolio to Simon, who opened it with careful reverence. The first piece was a charcoal drawing of an elderly man sitting on a park bench, feeding pigeons. The technical skill was impressive for someone so young, but what struck Andy was the emotional depth captured in the old man's expression. A lifetime of joys and sorrows rendered in graphite. This is incredible, Andy said, studying the drawing more closely. The way you've captured the light, the expression. Simon, this is really sophisticated work. Thanks, Simon said, but Andy could see how much the praise meant to him. This is Mr. Patterson. He comes to the park near our house every Tuesday to feed the birds. I started sketching him last summer. The next piece was a watercolor landscape, not the typical mountain or lake scene most young artists attempted, but an urban landscape showing a row of houses in what Andy recognized as a historically black neighborhood. The painting managed to capture both the dignity and the struggle inherent in the scene. This is where we live, Simon explained. I wanted to paint something that showed the beauty in our community, not just the problems everyone always focuses on. Andy felt something shift in his chest as he looked at his son's art. This wasn't just talent, this was vision, perspective, a young artist who already understood that art was about more than technique. You have your father's eye, Jaleesa said quietly, and when Andy looked at her, he saw pride mixed with something that might have been regret. And his mother's heart, Andy replied, meaning it completely. They spent the next hour going through Simon's portfolio. There were portraits of Jaleesa in various moods, concentrating on medical files, laughing at something off camera, sleeping in a chair that Andy recognized as the one from the waiting room. There were studies of hands, an obvious inheritance from Andy's own obsession with capturing the expressiveness of hands. There was a series of paintings exploring environmental themes, showing the beauty of nature alongside the damage caused by human activity. "I want to be an environmental lawyer," Simon explained as they looked at the environmental series. "But I think art can be part of advocacy too. People respond to images differently than they do to statistics." "You're absolutely right," Andy said. "Art has always been political, whether people admit it or not. The best artists find ways to make people feel something that changes how they think." "Is that what your art did before you stopped painting?" Andy was quiet for a moment, thinking about the paintings he'd created in college. Portraits of Jaleesa, yes, but also broader explorations of love, loss, hope, the complexity of human connection. "I tried. I wanted my art to mean something, not just be decorative." "Maybe you should try again," Simon suggested. "I mean, now that you're here and everything's different." "Maybe I should," Andy agreed, and was surprised to realize he actually meant it. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Reeves entered with a clipboard and the kind of smile that suggested good news. "How's our patient feeling this morning?" Dr. Reeves asked, moving to Simon's bedside to begin his examination. "Better," Simon said. "A lot better, actually." Dr. Reeves checked Simon's vitals, examined his eyes and mouth, felt his lymph nodes. "Blood work this morning shows excellent progress. Your white cell count is climbing steadily, and we're seeing good integration of the donor cells." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Jaleesa asked, though Andy suspected she already knew. "It means, barring any complications, Simon should be able to go home in about a week. He'll need to come in for regular monitoring, and he'll be on immunosuppressive medications for several months. But the transplant appears to be taking beautifully." Andy felt his knees go weak with relief. Home. Simon was going to go home. The bone marrow transplant was working. "There is one thing, though," Dr. Reeves continued, and Andy's heart seized. "Simon's going to need very careful monitoring during his recovery. His immune system will be compromised for months. He'll need to avoid crowds, be careful about exposure to illness, maintain a very controlled environment." "I understand," Jaleesa said. "I'll take leave from the hospital to care for him." "Actually," Dr. Reeves said with a slight smile, "I was hoping to discuss that with both of you. Simon's recovery would benefit from having multiple caregivers who understand his needs. Mr. Cole, I assume you're planning to remain in North Carolina for the foreseeable future?" Andy looked at Jaleesa, then at Simon, then back at the doctor. "Yes, absolutely. Good. Because recovery from this type of transplant is not just medical, it's emotional, psychological. Simon's going to need all the support he can get." After Dr. Reeves left, the room fell into a comfortable quiet. Simon was sketching in a new notebook someone had brought him, his movements more energetic than Andy had seen since arriving. Jaleesa was reading a medical journal, but Andy noticed she kept glancing up to watch Simon draw. "Jaleesa," Andy said quietly, "I meant what I said. About staying. I know we have a lot to figure out, but I'm not going anywhere." She looked up from her journal, and Andy saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. A cautious hope, maybe, or the beginning of trust. "I know," she said simply. "I'm starting to believe that." As if sensing the weight of the moment, Simon looked up from his sketching. "Hey, Dad. When I get out of here, will you teach me to paint the way you used to? Not just drawing, but actual painting. Andy felt his throat close with emotion. I'd love that. But I'm probably pretty rusty. Then we'll learn together, Simon said with the confidence of someone who'd just been given a second chance at life. We'll both start over. Andy looked at his son, this remarkable young man who'd inherited the best of both his parents, and realized that starting over was exactly what all three of them needed to do. Yeah, Andy said, his voice rough with emotion. We'll start over. All of us. And for the first time in 20 years, the future felt full of possibility instead of regret. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The hospital cafeteria at midnight was a sanctuary for insomniacs and the emotionally exhausted, a liminal space where conversations happened that couldn't survive in daylight. Andy sat across from Jaleesa at a corner table, 2 cups of terrible coffee growing cold between them. Simon had been discharged that morning, and they'd spent the day settling him into Jaleesa's house, arranging medications, discussing care routines with the visiting nurse. The domestic intimacy of it all, shopping for groceries together, debating the best placement for Simon's easel, sharing space in a kitchen that felt both foreign and familiar, had left them both on edge. Now, with Simon safely asleep in his own bed for the first time in months, the careful politeness they'd maintained was finally cracking. We can't keep pretending this is just about Simon, Jaleesa said suddenly, her voice cutting through the cafeteria's late-night quiet. Andy looked up from his coffee, studying her face in the harsh fluorescent lighting. She looked exhausted, but also determined. The expression of someone who decided to face something difficult head-on. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. Jaleesa's dark eyes flashed with something Andy hadn't seen since college, the fierce honesty that had first drawn him to her. We're dancing around each other like strangers, being so careful not to mention anything real, anything that matters. But I can't do it anymore, Andy. I can't pretend that having you in my house, watching you bond with our son, doesn't affect me. Andy felt his chest tighten. Jaleesa, no. She held up a hand, stopping him. For once in 20 years, I'm going to say what I really think, and you're going to listen. Andy nodded, recognizing the tone. This was Dr. Jefferson speaking, the woman who delivered difficult diagnoses and made life-or-death decisions. But underneath the professional authority, he could see the girl he'd fallen in love with, the one who'd never backed down from a hard conversation. Do you know what it was like? Jaleesa asked, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. Being 21 and pregnant and completely alone? Calling numbers that didn't work anymore? Going to places you used to live only to find out you'd moved without leaving a forwarding address? Andy's stomach clenched. Jaleesa. I'm not finished. Her voice rose slightly, then dropped as she remembered where they were. I called your father, Andy. Did you know that? 3 months pregnant, scared out of my mind, and I called Thaddeus Cole in Spokane. Andy felt the color drain from his face. You called my dad? He told me you'd made it very clear you wanted nothing to do with your past. He said you'd changed your name, moved across the country, that you were starting fresh, and didn't want any reminders of your old life. Jaleesa's laugh was hollow, bitter. He said if I really cared about you, I'd leave you alone to build your new life. The words hit Andy like physical blows. His father, the man who'd spent Andy's entire childhood telling him he'd never amount to anything, had actively sabotaged his chance to know about Simon. I never told him I wanted nothing to do with you, Andy said, his voice rough. Jesus, Jaleesa, I never said anything like that. Didn't you? Jaleesa's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You disappeared, Andy. You changed your name, vanished without a trace. What was I supposed to think? You were supposed to think that I was a scared kid who made the worst mistake of his life, Andy said desperately. You were supposed to think that I was an idiot who listened to your mother when she told me I'd ruin your future. My mother. Jaleesa's voice went flat, dangerous. What exactly did my mother say to you? Andy ran his hands through his hair, that old, nervous gesture he'd never managed to shake. How did you tell the woman you loved that her own mother had convinced you she was better off without you? She showed me the Johns Hopkins acceptance letter, Andy said finally. She told me how much potential you had, how far you could go in medicine. She said I was holding you back, that if I really loved you, I'd let you have the future you deserved. And you believed her. I was 23 years old, Jaleesa. I had no money, no prospects, no clear idea of what I wanted to do with my life. You had this incredible opportunity, and I thought— Andy's voice broke slightly. I thought if I loved you enough to step aside, you'd get everything you deserved. What I deserved, Jaleesa repeated slowly. Did it ever occur to you that what I deserved was the right to make my own choices about my life? That maybe I was smart enough to decide for myself whether love and career could coexist? Every day, Andy admitted. Every single day for 20 years. But not enough to stay and fight for us. The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and true. Andy had no defense because there wasn't one. He'd been a coward, plain and simple. He'd taken the easy way out, convincing himself it was noble when it was really just fear. You're right, he said quietly. I should have stayed. I should have fought for us, should have told your mother that our love was our business, should have trusted that you were strong enough to handle medical school and a relationship and whatever else life threw at us. Yes, Jaleesa said, tears finally spilling over. You should have. Because I would have, Andy. I would have found a way to make it all work, because I loved you that much. And instead I left you to handle pregnancy and medical school and single motherhood all by yourself. You left me to handle everything by myself, Jaleesa corrected. Not just the big things, the little things too. Simon's first steps, his first word, which was mama, by the way. His first day of school, his first heartbreak, his first art show. 20 years of birthday parties where I had to explain why Daddy wasn't there. 20 years of school forms that asked for father's information. 20 years of watching other families and wondering what we might have been. Each word was a knife cutting deeper than the last. Andy had built his empire telling himself he was honoring their love by staying away. But sitting here listening to Jaleesa, he realized he'd simply been honoring his own cowardice. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I can't undo any of that. I know sorry isn't enough for 20 years of absence. But Jaleesa, I need you to understand something. What? I never stopped loving you. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. I built my entire life around the hole you left, tried to fill it with work and success and anything else I could find, but nothing worked. You were it for me, Jaleesa. You were everything, and losing you nearly destroyed me. You didn't lose me, Jaleesa said fiercely. You threw me away. There's a difference. Andy flinched at the accuracy of the statement. You're right. I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too proud and too scared to believe I deserved it. And what about now? Jaleesa asked. Are you still too proud and too scared? The question hung between them, loaded with 20 years of hurt and hope. Andy looked at this woman, brilliant, beautiful, strong enough to raise an incredible son alone, successful enough to save lives every day, and wondered what right he had to ask for a second chance. I'm terrified, he admitted. Terrified that I'll mess this up again. Terrified that I'll hurt you and Simon. Terrified that I'm too broken to be what either of you needs. At least you're honest about it this time. This time is different, Jaleesa. I'm different. Not better, necessarily, but older, more aware of what matters. I know what I lost when I walked away from you, and I know I'll never get another chance like this. Jaleesa was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if she could read the truth in his features. What are you asking me, Andy? I'm asking if there's any chance, any possibility, that someday you might be able to forgive me. I'm asking if there's room in your life for someone who wants to spend whatever time he has left, making up for the time he wasted. And what about your life in Seattle? Your company? My business partner can handle things. The company practically runs itself at this point. Andy leaned forward slightly. Besides, what's the point of success if you don't have anyone to share it with? Jaleesa laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. You can't just uproot your entire life because you feel guilty about the past. This isn't about guilt, Andy said firmly. This is about love. This is about finally being brave enough to fight for what matters most. What if it's too late? Jaleesa asked, and Andy heard the vulnerability underneath the question. What if too much has happened? Too much time has passed? What if we can't find our way back to each other? Then we'll find our way to something new, Andy said. Something built on who we are now instead of who we were then. Jaleesa stared at him for another long moment, and Andy could see the war playing out behind her eyes, hope battling against caution, love fighting with self-protection. I can't promise you anything, she said finally. I can't promise that I'll be able to trust you again, or that this will work out the way either of us hopes. But Simon deserves to have his father in his life. And maybe I deserve the chance to find out if what we had was real or just something I've been romanticizing for 20 years. It wasn't a declaration of love, wasn't even really a yes, but it was possibility. It was a door opening instead of slamming shut. That's all I'm asking for, Andy said. A chance. Then you'll have it, Jaleesa said quietly. But Andy, if you hurt him, if you hurt Simon, I will never forgive you. Do you understand me? I understand, Andy said, and I won't. I promise you, I won't hurt either of you again. Jaleesa nodded, but Andy could see the skepticism in her eyes. Trust, once broken, didn't heal with words alone. It would take time, consistency, proof that he was the man he claimed to be now, rather than the boy who'd run away 20 years ago. We should get back, Jaleesa said, standing and gathering her things. Simon will wonder where we are. As they walked back through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage, Andy felt something shift between them. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by something raw but more honest. They'd finally said the things that needed saying, had finally acknowledged the magnitude of what had been lost and what might still be salvaged. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, and for the first time in 20 years, a beginning felt like enough. Chapter 7. Healing, Slowly. 3 weeks later, Andy discovered that redemption tasted like burnt coffee and sounded like his son's laughter echoing through a house that was slowly learning to accommodate 3 heartbeats instead of 2. He stood in Jaleesa's kitchen at 6 in the morning, attempting to master her temperamental coffee machine while she finished her morning run. Through the window, he could see Simon in the backyard, moving slowly but steadily through the gentle exercises his physical therapist had prescribed. The boy's strength was returning incrementally, some days better than others, but always forward progress. Andy had rented a modest apartment 10 minutes away, respecting Jaleesa's need for space while staying close enough to help with Simon's care. The arrangement was carefully negotiated, boundaries clearly drawn, but somehow it had evolved into something that felt almost like a routine. Andy would arrive early to help with Simon's morning medications, stay for breakfast, spend the day engaging in whatever activities Simon felt up to, then retreat to his apartment in the evenings unless specifically invited to stay longer. It was a delicate dance, this rebuilding of trust, but Andy was learning the steps. "Dad, you're burning the coffee again," Simon called from the back door, his voice carrying the gentle teasing that had become commonplace between them. "Your mother's coffee machine is possessed," Andy called back, but he was smiling as he dumped the bitter brew and started over. The easy familiarity still caught him off guard sometimes. The casual dad, the shared jokes, the way Simon had simply accepted him into their lives as if Andy had always been there. "Maybe you should stick to tea," Jaleesa suggested, appearing in the kitchen with the glow of someone who'd just completed a satisfying 5-mile run. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore running clothes that suggested she'd maintained the athletic lifestyle she'd cultivated in college. "I've been drinking coffee for 25 years, Andy protested. "How hard can it be?" "Apparently harder than building a tech empire," Jaleesa replied, but her tone was light, teasing rather than cutting. These small moments of easy banter had been increasing lately, glimpses of the couple they'd once been surfacing through the careful politeness of who they were now. Andy handed her the water bottle she'd left on the counter, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact was electric, as it always was, but neither of them pulled away immediately. Progress, Andy thought. Small, incremental progress. "How did Simon do with his exercises this morning?" Jaleesa asked, moving to the window to watch their son. "Better than yesterday. He managed all 15 minutes without getting winded." Andy joined her at the window, close enough to smell her subtle perfume, mixed with the clean scent of exercise. "His color is good, too. Dr. Reeves will be pleased." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Simon sketch something in the garden notebook he'd been keeping. The boy's artistic output had exploded since leaving the hospital, as if nearly losing his life had intensified his need to capture and create beauty. "I got a call yesterday," Jaleesa said suddenly, "from Seattle Children's Hospital. They're still interested in having me join their pediatric surgery team." Andy's stomach dropped, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "That's incredible, Jaleesa. It's exactly the kind of opportunity you've always deserved." "Is it?" She turned to study his face, and Andy realized this was a test. "You think I should take it?" Andy wanted to say no, wanted to tell her that leaving now would destroy the fragile foundation they'd been building. But he'd made that mistake once before, prioritizing his own needs over her autonomy. "I think you should do whatever makes you happiest," he said carefully. "What feels right for your career, for Simon's recovery, for your life?" "Very diplomatic," Jaleesa observed. "But that's not what I asked." Andy sighed, running his hand through his hair. "Honestly, the selfish part of me hopes you'll stay, but the part of me that loves you wants you to have every opportunity you've ever dreamed of, even if it means leaving North Carolina. And what if those two things aren't mutually exclusive?" Before Andy could ask what she meant, Simon burst through the back door with an excitement Andy hadn't seen since before his illness. "Dad, Mom, you have to see this," Simon said, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. "I just got an email from the Asheville Art Museum. They want to feature some of my environmental pieces in their youth exhibition next month." "Simon, that's incredible." Jaleesa's face lit up with maternal pride. "When did you submit work to them?" "I didn't. Apparently, Ms. Nash sent them photos of my paintings without telling me." Simon's grin was infectious. "But here's the best part. They want to feature father-son artistic collaborations. They're asking if you'd be willing to work on a piece with me, Dad." Andy felt his chest tighten with emotion. "You want to collaborate with me?" "Are you kidding? Of course I do. I mean, only if you want to. I know you haven't painted in a while, but—" "I'd be honored," Andy said, meaning it completely. "What did you have in mind?" Simon pulled out his phone, showing them images of his environmental series. "I was thinking we could do something about renewal, about how things that seem damaged can heal and become beautiful again." The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them. Andy caught Jaleesa's eye over Simon's head and saw understanding pass between them. Their son, wise beyond his years, was painting their story without even realizing it. "That sounds perfect," Andy said. "When do we start?" "How about now?" Simon asked. "I set up a workspace in the garage yesterday. 2 easels, plenty of natural light. Mom, you could even help if you want. I know you took art classes in college. Jaleesa laughed. I took one art class and I was terrible at it. You were not terrible, Andy said automatically. You had good instincts. You just needed more practice. Jaleesa gave him a sharp look. You remember my college art projects? I remember everything about college, Andy said quietly, and the simple honesty of the statement seemed to settle something in the air between them. They spent the morning in the garage-turned-studio, Andy and Simon working on their collaborative piece, while Jaleesa sat nearby, ostensibly reading medical journals but actually watching them paint. The father-son dynamic was easy, natural, built on shared perspective and complementary skills. Simon's youthful passion balanced Andy's more experienced technique, creating something neither could have achieved alone. You're really good at this, Simon said as Andy demonstrated a particular shading technique. I can see why you were successful as an artist. I was never successful as an artist, Andy corrected. I was successful as a businessman who happened to understand art. What's the difference? Andy considered this as he mixed colors on his palette. Success as an artist means creating work that matters to you, regardless of whether anyone buys it. Success as a businessman means creating products people want to buy, regardless of whether they matter to you. And which one are you doing now? Andy looked at the canvas in front of him, a landscape showing environmental damage giving way to renewal, painted in collaboration with the son he'd thought he'd lost, and realized he finally knew the answer. Now I'm just trying to be the man you and your mother deserve. That afternoon, while Simon napped, his energy still limited by his recovery, Andy found himself alone with Jaleesa in her living room. She was grading papers for a medical ethics course she taught part-time, and he was sketching ideas for his next collaboration with Simon. You're different, Jaleesa said suddenly, not looking up from her papers. Different how? Calmer, maybe, more present. In college, you always seemed like you were thinking about 3 things at once, like you couldn't quite settle into the moment. Andy set down his sketchbook. I was always worried about the future then, whether I'd be able to make it as an artist, whether I'd be able to provide for you the way you deserved, whether I was enough. And now I know the future is just a series of present moments strung together. And this present moment, sitting here with you while our son recovers upstairs, this is exactly where I want to be. Jaleesa finally looked up from her papers, studying his face with the careful attention she'd always paid to things that mattered. The Seattle offer is still on the table. I know. It would mean starting over in a new city, building new professional relationships, finding new communities. I know that too. It would also mean being close to your business, to the life you built there. Andy nodded, understanding where this conversation was heading. Jaleesa, what are you really asking me? I'm asking if you'd consider coming with us, if we decided to move to Seattle. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for days. Simon's recovery will take months, maybe years of careful monitoring. He'll need his father during that time. Just for Simon's recovery? Andy asked quietly. Jaleesa's cheeks flushed slightly. Not just for Simon. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Andy felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that had been locked for 20 years. Are you asking me to move to Seattle with you? He said carefully. I'm asking if you'd want to build something new with us. Not a recreation of what we had before, but something based on who we are now. Andy looked at this remarkable woman, brilliant, beautiful, brave enough to offer second chances to men who'd broken her heart, and felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble. Yes, he said simply, to all of it, to Seattle, to building something new, to being the man you both deserve. Yes, to whatever comes next, as long as it includes both of you. Jaleesa's smile was soft, tentative but genuine. "It won't be easy, Andy. There's still so much we need to work through, so much trust that needs to be rebuilt." "I know," Andy said, "but we have time now, and we have Simon, who's apparently wise enough to paint metaphors about healing before we even realize we need them." Jaleesa laughed, and the sound carried echoes of the girl Andy had fallen in love with 23 years ago. "He is pretty wise for someone who just turned 19. He gets that from his mother, and his artistic vision from his father." Andy reached across the space between them, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Jaleesa took it, their fingers intertwining with the careful reverence of people who'd learned not to take such moments for granted. "So," Andy said, squeezing her hand gently, "when do we tell Simon he's going to see the Pacific Northwest?" "How about at dinner?" Jaleesa suggested. "I think he'll be excited about the adventure." "The adventure," Andy repeated, testing the words. After 20 years of living in the past, the idea of adventure, of a future worth building, felt foreign and wonderful. From upstairs came the sound of Simon waking from his nap, calling for them both. Andy and Jaleesa rose together, still holding hands, ready to share news that would change all their lives. Ready, finally, to build something beautiful from the pieces of what they'd once broken. Chapter 8. The Almost Kiss. The evening air carried the promise of autumn and second chances as Andy helped Jaleesa clear dinner dishes from her back porch, where they'd shared the first family meal that had truly felt like family. Simon had taken the news about Seattle with characteristic enthusiasm, immediately launching into plans for exploring the Pacific Northwest's environmental activism scene and the city's renowned art community. His excitement was infectious, filling the house with an energy that spoke of futures worth anticipating, rather than pasts worth mourning. Now, with Simon inside video chatting with friends about the move, Andy and Jaleesa found themselves alone on the porch swing that had become their unofficial meeting place for conversations that mattered. The swing creaked gently as they settled into its familiar rhythm, close enough that Andy could smell Jaleesa's perfume mixing with the evening air. "I still can't believe you said yes," Jaleesa said quietly, her voice carrying wonder rather than doubt. "I can't believe you asked," Andy replied, studying her profile in the soft porch light. "3 months ago, I didn't even know I had a son. Now you're asking me to relocate my entire life to build a future with both of you. Having second thoughts?" "Not for a single second." Andy's response was immediate, certain. "If anything, I'm wondering what I did to deserve this chance." Jaleesa turned to face him, her expression serious. "You didn't have to deserve it, Andy. Sometimes second chances aren't about what we've earned. Sometimes they're about what we're brave enough to reach for." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy with implication. This wasn't just about geographic relocation or co-parenting arrangements. This was about the possibility of rebuilding a love that had survived 20 years of separation. "Tell me about Seattle," Andy said, needing to step back from the intensity of the moment. "What draws you to this position?" Jaleesa's eyes lit up with professional passion. "Seattle Children's is pioneering some incredible techniques in pediatric cardiac surgery. The position would let me lead a team developing new approaches for complex congenital heart defects. It's exactly the kind of cutting-edge work I've always dreamed of doing." "And the timing?" "With Simon's recovery, Dr. Reeves thinks a change of scenery might actually be beneficial. Seattle has excellent medical facilities for ongoing monitoring, and the climate is supposed to be good for immune system recovery." Jaleesa paused, then smiled. "Plus, Simon's been talking about environmental law programs at the University of Washington since he was 15. This move would put him close to his first-choice school." Andy nodded, impressed by how thoroughly she'd considered every angle. It was vintage Jaleesa, methodical, thoughtful, leaving nothing to chance. When would you want to make the move? The position starts in January. That would give Simon time to finish his recovery here, complete his high school requirements remotely, and prepare for college applications. Jaleesa tucked her legs up on the swing, turning to face him more fully. What about your business? How easy would it be to relocate? Easier than you might think. Most of our operations are digital anyway, and my business partner has been wanting more autonomy. The hardest part will be telling Dorian I'm finally ready to step back from day-to-day operations. You'd really do that? Step back from the company you built? Andy looked at her, this brilliant, beautiful woman who'd raised his son with such grace and strength, and realized the answer was simpler than he'd expected. Jaleesa, 20 years ago I built that company to prove I was worthy of someone like you. Now I know that worth isn't measured in revenue or market share. It's measured in moments like this, in being present for the people who matter most. Something shifted in Jaleesa's expression, a softening that made Andy's chest tight with hope and longing. You really have changed. We both have. The question is whether we've changed in ways that are compatible. Jaleesa studied his face in the porch light, and Andy felt exposed under her gaze, seen in ways that were both terrifying and wonderful. I think we might be, she said quietly. The evening breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of the honeysuckle that grew along Jaleesa's fence. Somewhere in the distance, crickets began their nightly symphony, and the porch light cast dancing shadows as leaves moved in the wind. Can I tell you something? Jaleesa asked. Of course. I used to dream about you. For years after you left, I'd have these dreams where you'd come back and explain everything, where we'd find our way back to each other. She laughed softly, but it wasn't a happy sound. I hated those dreams because they made waking up so much harder. Andy felt his throat tighten. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something. Jaleesa turned to face him fully, her knees almost touching his. When you showed up at the hospital, when I saw you standing in that hallway, my first thought wasn't relief that Simon might be saved. My first thought was that one of those dreams had finally come true. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and full of possibility. Andy wanted to reach for her, wanted to close the distance that had existed between them for 20 years, but something in her expression warned him to wait. But dreams and reality are different things, Jaleesa continued. Dreams don't include morning breath and dirty dishes and the way people change when they're tired or stressed. Dreams don't include the hard work of rebuilding trust or the fear that someone might leave again when things get difficult. I'm not going to leave, Andy said quietly. I know you might not believe that yet, but I'm not going anywhere. I want to believe that, Jaleesa said. More than you know. But Andy, I need you to understand what's at stake here. It's not just my heart this time. It's Simon's too. If you change your mind, if you decide this is too hard or too complicated, you won't just be breaking my heart again. You'll be breaking his. I understand, Andy said, and I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I will never hurt either of you that way. Jaleesa nodded, but Andy could see the caution in her eyes. Words were just words, after all. Promises were only as good as the person making them, and he'd broken promises before. Tell me about your dreams, Andy said. The ones where I came back. What happened in them? Jaleesa's cheeks flushed slightly. You really want to know? I really want to know. We'd talk. For hours and hours, we'd just talk about everything we'd missed, everything that had happened. You'd meet Simon, and he'd love you immediately. We'd figure out how to be a family. Jaleesa paused, her voice growing softer. And then you'd kiss me, and it would feel like no time had passed at all. The longing in her voice was unmistakable, and Andy felt it echoing in his own chest. They were sitting so close now that he could count her eyelashes, could see the faint freckles on her nose that had always appeared in summer. "Jaleesa," he said quietly. "Yes? What we're building now, this real thing with all its complications and uncertainties, it's going to be better than any dream. How can you be so sure? Because dreams are just wishes. What we have now is choice. Every day we're choosing this, choosing each other, choosing to build something worth having." Jaleesa's eyes searched his face, and Andy saw the exact moment when her careful control began to crack. Her gaze dropped to his lips, then back to his eyes, and the air between them became charged with 20 years of suppressed longing. "Andy," she whispered. "I know," he said, understanding completely. The pull between them was magnetic, inevitable, the culmination of weeks of careful rebuilding and cautious hope. They leaned toward each other slowly, giving each other time to pull back, to reconsider, to choose safety over desire. But neither of them pulled back. The space between them grew smaller and smaller until Andy could feel her breath on his lips, until he could see himself reflected in her dark eyes. Just as their lips were about to touch, the porch door burst open. "Mom, Dad, you have to see this," Simon called, stepping onto the porch with his laptop. "The art museum just posted about our collaboration on their social media, and it's already gotten hundreds of likes." Andy and Jaleesa sprang apart like teenagers caught by their parents, both of them breathing hard and avoiding eye contact. Simon, fortunately, was too excited about the social media attention to notice the tension crackling in the air. "Look at this comment," Simon continued, settling into the chair across from the swing. "Someone said our piece captures the eternal hope for environmental and personal renewal. Isn't that amazing?" "Amazing," Jaleesa agreed, her voice slightly hoarse. "Dad, you okay? You look kind of flushed." "Just excited about the exhibition," Andy managed, grateful for the dim porch lighting that hid his expression. They spent the next hour looking at the museum's social media posts, reading comments from people who were already planning to attend the exhibition. Simon was beside himself with excitement, already planning his next series of paintings and talking about applying to art schools as well as law programs. When Simon finally went inside to call his friend Marcus about the exhibition, Andy and Jaleesa found themselves alone again. But the moment had passed, the spell broken by reality and responsibility, and the reminder that they weren't just two people exploring their feelings, they were parents, co-parents, building something that included their son. "We should probably talk about what just happened," Jaleesa said quietly. "Or what almost happened," Andy corrected. "Andy, You don't have to explain," Andy said gently. "I understand. We're not ready for that yet. There's too much at stake, too much we still need to figure out." Jaleesa looked at him with something that might have been gratitude or relief or disappointment, possibly all three. "Thank you for understanding." "I'll wait," Andy said simply. "However long it takes, whatever you need to feel safe with this, with us, I'll wait. And if I'm never ready, if I can't get past the fear," Andy considered this seriously, "then we'll build the best co-parenting relationship in history, and I'll spend the rest of my life grateful for the chance to know my son and to have you back in my life, even if it's not the way I'd hoped." Jaleesa's eyes filled with tears. "How did you get so patient?" 20 years of missing you," Andy said honestly. "It teaches a man to appreciate whatever he can get." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the stars appear in the clear North Carolina sky. The almost kiss hung between them, not awkward, but rather like a promise of what might be possible when the time was right. When Jaleesa finally stood to go inside, Andy caught her hand gently. "Jaleesa?" "Yes?" "For what it's worth, I think you're worth waiting for. You always have been." Her smile was soft, tentative, but real. Ask me again in Seattle, she said, when we've had time to see if this really works. I will, Andy promised, and I'll keep asking until you're ready to say yes. As Jaleesa went inside, Andy remained on the porch swing, looking up at the stars and thinking about dreams versus reality, about patience versus passion, about the delicate balance between hope and caution that defined second chances. The almost kiss had been perfect in its imperfection, a reminder that some things were worth waiting for, that the best love stories weren't about grand gestures, but about choosing each other again and again, even when it would be easier to walk away. Especially then. Chapter 9. The Return to Seattle. The Pacific Northwest welcomed them home with a December drizzle that painted the city in watercolors, soft and forgiving and full of possibility. Andy stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, watching Jaleesa and Simon explore their new surroundings, 3 floors below in the building's courtyard garden. It had been Jaleesa's idea to find an apartment in the same building, close enough for Simon's ongoing medical needs, far enough to maintain the careful boundaries they'd established. Seattle looked different now than it had when Andy had left in October. The city that had once felt like a gilded cage now seemed full of potential, every familiar street corner holding the promise of new memories with the people who mattered most. "Sir," Miranda appeared in the doorway with documents. "These are the transition papers you requested. Mr. Sinclair has reviewed everything and is ready to assume full operational control." Andy turned from the window, still amazed by how easily he'd been able to step back from cold digital arts. Dorian had been running the company brilliantly in his absence. "Tell Dorian I'll sign everything tomorrow," Andy said. "And Miranda? Thank you for everything over the years." "It's been my pleasure, sir. If I may say so, you seem lighter these days." Andy smiled. Lighter was exactly right. For the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was living his life instead of just surviving it. His phone buzzed with a text from Simon. "Dad, you have to see this view from Mom's apartment. The Space Needle looks like it's close enough to touch." Andy's chest warmed at the casual "Dad," which had become as natural as breathing. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator. Jaleesa's apartment was a study in elegant functionality, modern but warm, with large windows that captured the city's dramatic skyline. Simon had claimed the room with the best light for his art studio, already unpacking canvases when Andy arrived. "This is incredible," Simon said, gesturing toward the window. "I can see the sound, the mountains, everything. I'm going to paint this view 100 different ways." "Save some energy for getting settled first," Jaleesa said, but her tone was indulgent. She looked radiant in the natural light, more relaxed than Andy had seen her since the hospital. "How was your first day at the hospital?" Andy asked. "Overwhelming in the best possible way," Jaleesa replied, her eyes bright with professional excitement. "The cardiac team is incredible, and the facilities are even better than I'd hoped." They spent the afternoon helping Simon settle into his new space, unpacking art supplies with the careful attention of people who understood that home was something you built, not something you found. Andy found himself stealing glances at Jaleesa throughout the day, noticing how she moved through the space with growing confidence. As evening approached, Simon declared his room perfect and suggested they order pizza to celebrate. They ate sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by moving boxes, talking about the future with the enthusiasm of people who finally had one worth planning. "I looked up the University of Washington's environmental law program," Simon said. "They have an amazing clinic that works on real cases involving climate justice, and their art department has partnerships with environmental advocacy groups." "Sounds like you could double major," Andy suggested. "Law and art. Use both tools to change the world." "Is that crazy? Trying to do both?" Jaleesa and Andy exchanged a look over Simon's head. Their son had inherited both their ambition and their tendency to see obstacles as challenges to overcome. "I don't think it's crazy at all," Jaleesa said. "Some of the most effective advocates are the ones who can communicate in multiple languages: legal, artistic, emotional." After Simon went to bed, Andy and Jaleesa found themselves on her balcony, looking out over the Seattle skyline. The city sparkled below them, alive with possibilities neither had dared imagine months ago. "I can't believe we're here," Jaleesa said quietly. "3 months ago, Simon was dying. You were a stranger from my past, and I was drowning in fear and regret. Now, ... Now, I feel like I'm finally living the life I was meant to have." Andy felt something shift in his chest at her words. Over the past months, they'd built something beautiful and careful. A friendship deepened by shared purpose. A co-parenting relationship built on mutual respect. And underneath it all, the steady current of love that had never really disappeared. "Jaleesa," Andy said, turning to face her, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. That night on your porch, when Simon interrupted us. Do you ever think about what might have happened if he hadn't?" Jaleesa was quiet for a long moment, her breath visible in the cool December air. "Every day," she admitted finally. "I think about it every day. And I think we weren't ready then. We were still figuring out how to be in each other's lives again, still learning to trust that this was real." Jaleesa turned to meet his gaze. "But Andy, being here with you, watching you with Simon, seeing how you've honored every promise you've made, I think I might be ready now." Andy's heart stuttered in his chest. "Ready for what?" "Ready to find out if what we had was real, or if we can build something even better." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with 20 years of longing and months of careful rebuilding. Andy wanted to reach for her, wanted to kiss her the way he'd been dreaming of doing since that interrupted moment on her porch. But there was something he needed to tell her first. "Before we take that step, there's something you should know," Andy said. Jaleesa's expression grew cautious. "What?" "I got a call this afternoon from Dr. Lysander Cross." Andy watched Jaleesa's face carefully as he mentioned her former colleague's name. Dr. Cross had been courting Jaleesa for months before Simon got sick, and Andy knew the man represented everything logical and safe. "Lysander called you." Jaleesa's voice was carefully neutral. "How did he even get your number?" "He tracked me down through the hospital. He wanted to let me know he was flying out here this weekend to propose." Jaleesa went very still. "He what?" "He has a ring and a speech prepared. He's booked a room at the Four Seasons and made reservations at the best restaurant in the city. He wanted to give me the courtesy of knowing his intentions toward you." "I can't believe he did that," Jaleesa said, but her voice carried anger rather than pleasure. "I can't believe he thought he needed to talk to you before talking to me." "So you don't have feelings for him?" Jaleesa turned to face Andy fully, and in the city lights reflected in her eyes, he saw something that made his breath catch. "Andy, Dr. Cross is a good man. He's stable and successful, and he's made it very clear he'd like to marry me. On paper, he's everything a rational woman should want." Andy felt his stomach drop. But I'm not a rational woman when it comes to love. I never have been. If I were rational, I would have forgotten about you 20 years ago and built a life with someone who never left." Jaleesa stepped closer to him. "If I were rational, I wouldn't have spent 20 years comparing every man to a memory. If I were rational, I wouldn't have fallen in love with you all over again while watching you learn to be Simon's father." "Jaleesa," Andy breathed. "I'm not going to marry Lysander Cross," she said firmly. "I'm not going to marry anyone unless it's someone I can't imagine living without, someone who makes me feel alive and challenged and completely myself." "And is there someone like that?" Andy asked, though he hardly dared hope. You know there is, Jaleesa said softly. There always has been. The question is whether you're brave enough to fight for us this time, even if it means dealing with a rival who's everything I should want on paper. Andy felt something powerful rise in his chest, not jealousy exactly, but determination. 20 years ago, he'd walked away without a fight. This time would be different. Jaleesa Jefferson, he said, reaching for her hands, I have loved you for 23 years. I have built a fortune and convinced myself it was enough, but it never was. You are the only woman who has ever held my heart, and if Dr. Cross thinks he can win you with logic and expensive restaurants, he clearly doesn't understand who he's dealing with. And who is he dealing with? Jaleesa asked, stepping closer. A woman who chose to study medicine at Johns Hopkins instead of staying close to her college boyfriend. A woman who raised an incredible son while building a brilliant career. A woman who was brave enough to track down her ex-lover when her child was dying. And even braver to give that ex-lover a second chance at love. Andy. I'm not done, Andy said, his voice growing stronger. He's dealing with a woman who deserves grand gestures and expensive restaurants, yes, but who also deserves someone who knows that her favorite coffee is too strong for most people, that she gets a crinkle between her eyebrows when she's concentrating, that she hums without realizing it when she's happy. Jaleesa's eyes were bright with tears now, but she was smiling. He's dealing with a woman who should be with someone who knows her, really knows her. Not just someone who wants to possess her, Andy continued. And Jaleesa, I know you. I've always known you. Even 20 years apart couldn't change that. Are you asking me to choose? Jaleesa asked. I'm asking you to choose yourself, Andy said. To choose the love that makes you feel most like who you really are, even if it's messier and more complicated than the alternative. Jaleesa stared at him for a long moment, and Andy could see the decision forming in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and certain. Then I choose you, she said. I choose us. I choose the love that's worth fighting for, even when it's scary. Andy felt his knees go weak with relief and joy. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This time, when they moved toward each other, there was no hesitation, no interruption, no doubt. Their lips met with 20 years of longing behind them and a lifetime of possibility ahead. The kiss was everything Andy had dreamed it would be, and nothing like he'd expected. Soft and fierce, familiar and new, tasting of tears and laughter and the particular sweetness of dreams finally coming true. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jaleesa rested her forehead against Andy's. So what do we do about Dr. Cross? She asked. We let him give his speech, Andy said. And then you give him yours. You tell him you're flattered, but that your heart belongs to someone else. And then what? Andy smiled, feeling more like himself than he had in 20 years. Then we figure out how to plan a life together, all three of us. I love the sound of that, Jaleesa said. I love you, Andy replied. Still, always, forever. Forever sounds perfect, Jaleesa whispered and kissed him again. Below them, Seattle sparkled with promise, and somewhere inside the apartment, their son slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that his family was finally complete. They had chosen each other. Despite the odds, despite the years, despite all the logical reasons why it shouldn't work, they had chosen love, and this time they were going to fight for it. Chapter 10. 20 Years of Heartbeat. 6 months later, the chapel at Seattle Children's Hospital had been transformed into something that looked more like an art gallery than a wedding venue, with Simon's paintings lining the walls like stained glass windows, telling the story of love, loss, and second chances. Andy stood at the makeshift altar, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. Beside him, Simon, now healthy, vibrant, and serving as best man, grinned with the particular satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking efforts had finally paid off. "Dad, relax," Simon whispered. "She's going to show up. She's been planning this day for months." "I know," Andy replied, but his voice came out slightly hoarse. "I just can't quite believe it's real." "Believe it," Simon said firmly. "You two have been disgustingly happy for months." Andy looked around the small chapel, taking in the faces of the people who had become family. Serafina sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with tissues. Cordelia Nash was capturing everything with her camera. Ezekiel Thompson stood ready to officiate, his presence lending gravitas to the proceedings. Even Evangeline Jefferson was there, elegant in navy blue, looking like the proud mother of the bride she'd never expected to become. The reconciliation between Jaleesa and her mother had been gradual but complete. Dr. Reeves sat with colleagues from both Presbyterian Hospital and Seattle Children's. And in the back, Dorian Sinclair, who had flown in specifically for the wedding, claiming he needed to meet the woman who'd finally tamed the great Andy Cole. The chapel doors opened and Isadora Jefferson appeared, radiant in her role as maid of honor. She gave Andy a thumbs up, then took her place opposite Simon. "Ready?" Ezekiel asked quietly. Andy nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd ever be ready for this moment. The moment when Jaleesa Jefferson would walk down the aisle and become his wife. The first notes of the processional began. Not traditional wedding music, but a piece that Simon had composed specifically for this day, played by a string quartet. The melody was complex and beautiful, weaving together themes of separation and reunion. Then the chapel doors opened again, and Jaleesa appeared. Andy's breath caught in his throat. She was wearing a dress that seemed to capture light itself. Not white, but a shade of cream that complemented her skin tone perfectly, elegant in its simplicity, but stunning in its effect. She carried a bouquet of white roses mixed with honeysuckle, a tribute to the porch where they'd first tried to kiss as adults. But it was her expression that undid him completely. She was glowing with happiness, her eyes bright with tears that spoke of joy rather than sorrow, and when her gaze found his, Andy felt the last 20 years collapse into nothing. She walked toward him with steady steps, unescorted by choice. "I'm not being given away," she'd said firmly during the planning. "I'm choosing this, choosing him, of my own free will." With each step, Andy felt more like the man he'd always wanted to be. When she reached the altar, Jaleesa handed her bouquet to Isadora and turned to face Andy. Up close, he could see the faint freckles on her nose, the tiny scar on her chin from childhood, the laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived despite its heartbreaks. "Hi," she whispered, and Andy heard 23 years of love in that simple word. "Hi, beautiful," he whispered back, using the endearment that had once been forbidden but was now claimed with joy. Ezekiel began the ceremony with words about love that endures, about second chances and the courage required to build something beautiful from broken pieces. But Andy barely heard him, lost as he was in Jaleesa's eyes. "Andy and Jaleesa have written their own vows," Ezekiel announced. "Andy, would you like to begin?" Andy reached into his jacket pocket for the piece of paper where he'd written his carefully planned words, then thought better of it. This moment called for truth, not preparation. "Jaleesa," he began, his voice stronger than he'd expected. 23 years ago, I fell in love with a brilliant, beautiful woman who challenged me to be better than I thought I could be. Then I spent 20 years trying to convince myself that losing her was the price I had to pay for loving her." Jaleesa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I was wrong about almost everything back then," Andy continued. "I was wrong to think I wasn't worthy of your love. I was wrong to think that leaving would protect you. I was wrong to believe that success could fill the hole you left in my heart. But I was right about one thing," Andy said, reaching for her hands. "I was right to love you. You are everything I believed you were at 21, and more than I could have imagined. You are brilliant and strong and compassionate. You are an incredible mother, an exceptional doctor, and the bravest person I know." Andy paused, overwhelmed by emotion. "I promise you this," he said finally. "I will never again let fear make my decisions. I will never again choose what seems logical over what feels right. I will love you and Simon with everything I have for as long as I live, and I will spend every day proving that some love stories are worth waiting for." Jaleesa was crying openly now, but her smile was radiant. She squeezed his hands, then began her own vows. "Andy," she said, her voice clear despite the tears, "you asked me once if I believed in second chances. I told you I believed in fighting for what matters. What I didn't tell you was that you had always mattered to me, even when I was furious with you, even when I convinced myself I'd moved on." She took a shaky breath before continuing. "For 20 years I measured every man against a memory. I told myself it was unfair to them, that I needed to let go of the past and embrace the future. But the truth was, none of them were you. None of them challenged me the way you did. None of them saw me the way you did. None of them loved me the way you did. When you showed up at the hospital that day, I thought you were there out of obligation, out of guilt, maybe out of some misguided sense of responsibility," Jaleesa continued. "But watching you with Simon, watching you become the father he needed, watching you become the man I always knew you could be, I realized you weren't there out of obligation. You were there out of love." Andy felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I promise you this," Jaleesa said, echoing his words. "I will never again let the past dictate my future. I will never again choose safety over love. I will trust you with my heart, with our son's heart, with the life we're building together. And I will love you not just for who you were, but for who you've become, and for who you're still becoming." Ezekiel stepped forward with the rings, simple bands that Andy and Jaleesa had chosen together, elegant in their simplicity, but inscribed with words that mattered. Still, always, forever. As they exchanged rings, Andy felt something fundamental shift inside him. He was no longer the boy who'd walked away 20 years ago, no longer the man who'd built an empire to fill a void. He was Jaleesa's husband, Simon's father, part of a family that had been forged by loss, but strengthened by love. "By the power vested in me by the state of Washington," Ezekiel said with a smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Andy, you may kiss your bride." Andy stepped closer to Jaleesa, cupping her face in his hands. "Mrs. Cole," he said softly. "I like the sound of that," Jaleesa whispered. When their lips met, the chapel erupted in applause and cheers, but Andy heard none of it. There was only Jaleesa, only this kiss, only this moment when every dream he'd ever had finally came true. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying, Simon stepped forward with a grin. "Finally," he said, wrapping both his parents in a three-way hug that felt like coming home. "Took you too long enough." The reception was held in the hospital's rooftop garden, overlooking the Seattle skyline. As the evening progressed, Andy found himself stealing quiet moments with his wife. The word still felt miraculous, watching her laugh with friends, dance with their son, move through the celebration with confidence. "Any regrets?" Jaleesa asked during their first dance, her head resting on Andy's shoulder as they swayed to the music Simon had composed for them. "Only one," Andy said, and felt her stiffen slightly. "I regret that it took us 20 years to get here." Jaleesa lifted her head to look at him. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think we needed those 20 years. I think we needed to become the people we are now before we could build something that would last." Andy considered this, thinking about the scared boy he'd been at 23, the driven woman Jaleesa had been, the way life had shaped them both into people capable of this kind of mature, enduring love. "You're probably right," he said, "but I'm still grateful we don't have to wait any longer." "No more waiting," Jaleesa agreed, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him softly. "From now on, we move forward together." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Andy found himself on the rooftop's edge with Simon, both of them looking out over the city lights. "Thank you," Andy said quietly. "For what?" "For being the kind of person who made it impossible for me to walk away again. For being wise enough to see what your mother and I couldn't see ourselves." Simon smiled. "You know what the best part about all this is?" "What?" "I finally have the complete story. For 21 years, I only knew half of who I was. Now I know both halves, and they fit together perfectly." Andy felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Simon, I need you to know something. You were already complete before I came back. Your mother raised an incredible man, and that was all her doing." "Maybe," Simon said, "but now I'm complete and I have my dad. That's even better." Later that night, after the guests had gone home and Simon had retreated to his own apartment, Andy and Jaleesa sat on their balcony, still in their wedding clothes, sharing a quiet bottle of champagne and watching the city settle into sleep. "So," Jaleesa said, curled up against Andy's side, "what now?" "Now we live," Andy said simply. "We wake up together every morning and figure out what comes next. We support Simon through college. We excel at our careers. We travel to places we've never been. We do all the ordinary, extraordinary things that married couples do." "Sounds perfect," Jaleesa said. "It will be," Andy said with certainty. "It won't always be easy, but it will be perfect, because it will be ours." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights of Seattle twinkle below them. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded in the harbor, and the wind carried the scent of salt water and possibility. "Andy," Jaleesa said sleepily. "Yeah, I love you. Still. Always. Forever." "I love you too," Andy replied, tightening his arms around his wife. 20 years of heartbeat, and it all led to this. "To this," Jaleesa agreed. As Seattle settled into midnight around them, Andy Cole, formerly Andrew Kowalski, the boy who'd once painted dreams and called them love, held his wife close and marveled at the peculiar mathematics of the heart. Some love stories ended with a beginning, some began with an ending. Theirs had simply been waiting 20 years to continue, and now, finally, they had all the time in the world.